I'm not very happy with the draft paper. I've added more information in the slides. I wrote this paper before I read any of the other papers, which are quite important and I think would change my argument a bit, including, I wrote it before I'd seen the Zero Car Growth Norwegian paper, and I think to avoid misunderstanding, I would say I'm in agreement with that paper, about 90%. I have some questions about the other 10%, but I don't want to start that argument before they've presented their paper. I just wanted to mention that. Now, I take a historical view, and my hypothesis is that there has been a nearly universal urban experience lasting for over a century, which is a contested and unresolved conflict between two main lines of argument, providing for increased car traffic or limiting and reversing that increase. That current policy debate is not a new one, although it is particularly important now for all sorts of reasons. Now, if this proposition is right, it does present a problem with how to discuss it, because we know the dates are different in different cities, and the sequence, and there's a problem, therefore, how do we discuss this in general terms? Each city and country has its own distinct history, and from time to time there are leaders or role models among the network of cities who are different from time to time. I remember when Freiburg and Nuremberg were the holy grail of transport planners in much of Europe and wider, and visits to those places where you could walk for a kilometre or more in a town centre without encountering traffic were a revelation. Nobody had ever seen anything like that before. Similarly, London and Stockholm have been particularly important in road user charging. Amsterdam and Copenhagen have now thought to be the leaders on cycling. Paris has been doing some very important work on road reallocation of space. My proposition is, I would love it to be untrue, that there is no city which has yet used all the instruments of sustainable transport policy in a consistent and coherent way. And that means at the same time as all sorts of exciting and progressive transport initiatives, at the same time the effect of them has been undermined by policies on parking or on road building or on prices which act in the opposite direction to the main policy argument. For example, we now have strongly increasing public transport prices and reducing the price of car use at the same time as a policy objective of moving from car to public transport. And that is what I call an unresolved conflict, which cannot make us as successful as we ought to be. You can't see the details of this, but this arranges some cities, not my choice of cities, in order of the proportion of people travelling by car. So it's a mode split discussion, and the order, well, let's just read out in order the cities. Paris comes out very high, Amsterdam and Zurich, then Madrid and Vienna and Berlin and Budapest. Copenhagen on that measure and Oslo don't come out as leaders, nor does London or Brussels. And Moscow, and to my surprise Rome, comes out at the bottom of that list. Now, all these statistics are questionable because every time you try and do comparisons, there are differences of definition and data reliability and source and so on. But it does indicate that the range of, quote, starting points that our cities are moving from is very, very different. They're all trying to move in the same direction. They're not trying to move to reproduce the histories of each other, but nevertheless the starting points are different. Now, to take a couple of examples of that, going back to Freiburg, a very important city, the use of the central area in particular was path-breaking, and the changes have shown a reduction in car use from the mid-1970s and in the 1980s. That's 40 and 50 years ago. If we look at cycling, those cities which have had a turning point, that turning point has not been in the last couple of years. It was pre-1980. Not all cities have had such a turning point, but that's where we look to for the initiatives which first started to change the trend. If we move to policy statements, I'll start. It's not what the first policy statement of important, but it was the policy statement coordinated by this body, or its predecessor, the European Conference of Ministers of Transport. I think in this building, if I'm not mistaken, although the launch was elsewhere. And look at what they agreed unanimously, 28, I think, Ministers of Transport on behalf of their government in 1990. Effective and acceptable means of reducing the use of the private car in urban areas need to be applied. We need taxes and regulations to reduce consumption. And this is interesting. Measures to reduce the greenhouse effect. This is in 1990, 30 years ago. Traffic management to change modal split. Polluter pays charging to reduce environmental damage. And the appraisal of policy alternatives should systematically include options of not building roads and doing other things instead. That's more or less the same set of agenda items as we have on our agenda now. And I think it's very important to note that the policy agenda has been so long-lasting. Now, moving forward a bit, another initiative of the European Conference of Ministers of Transport, I think in this building, I'm not sure, was a debate which had started in the US and in the UK at about the same time. Are we already reaching peak car? Peak car by analogy with peak oil, which was much discussed at that time. There were very distinct signs at a national aggregate level of levelling off of car ownership growth, and an argument which was unresolved at that time about why. There were arguments, it's only a temporary phenomenon due to difficult economic circumstances, or it's a structural shift in the nature of demand and the nature of policy, and both of those are defensible. The interesting thing, of course, about levelling off is that's consistent with three different trajectories looking much alike. If it's a temporary economic phenomenon, then you get a levelling off and then it takes off again and restores the earlier growth. If it's a saturation level, then it would level off and stay level. If it's a reversal due to policy implications or other social trends, then it levels off for a period en route to turning down. All of those curves look identical in terms of at one point of time what you're expecting to see. Now, what that meant was that the question of are we seeing peak car had to be disaggregated. the question simply could not be resolved using national traffic growth. And if you think about the logic of it, if national traffic growth were stable and was going to stay stable, some places and groups were growing, as we know to be the case. That must imply, it's unavoidable, that other places or groups must already be declining. And that was the key subject. Where are these places and groups, and what are their reasons for declining car ownership at a time when it was thought that this was a monotonic social trend which only went in one direction. So the debate about national statistics stopped. It wasn't leading anywhere. And some countries stopped talking about it. There were some further research projects to try and look at the details of the national trends. But the most important research at that point was where and later who. Now, the where question was all about cities. You probably can't see the details of that. A turning point was much earlier, about 1991 in London and about 2000, with a rather prominent pattern. London had declining car use most, the big cities next, then the towns, and the smaller towns and rural areas weren't declining at all. And if you get the same picture, if you look at car use in different road types, the rural roads were actually increasing in traffic, the cities rather level, and only London showing a decline. So that was one disaggregation phenomenon. What we're talking about, if we're talking about peak car or car reversal, is primarily urban areas. The second dimension was who, and there were lots of research projects about trying to track this down, of which I would single one result as being overwhelmingly the most important. And that was when you look at the demographic structure, particularly age. It dwarfed all other effects. And Peter Hedekar in particular, again, I'm sorry you can't quite see the detail, put the two factors, the degree of urbanisation and the age structure together, and came to the conclusion that young people and towns were the key indicators of declining car use. Old people and less urban areas, in combination or separately, were the chief indicators of increasing car use. And I'll only say one thing about national British politics at the moment, which, no, I won't even say at the end of that sentence. The astonishing thing is that demographic, youth and urbanisation, exactly corresponds with the voting pattern of the general election that we had last week. Even the idea that the dividing line between who was increasing car use and who was decreasing car use was at about the age of 50. I mean, quite old. It's not the 20-year-olds at all. And that same seems to apply to political voting intentions and to car use. I cannot think what follows from that, but it's an observation which I can't resist being intrigued by. Anyway, let's look more closely at this youth effect. What this shows is a series of cohorts. It's a sort of quasi-dynamic analysis where, if you look at the left-hand picture, the upper line is the earliest cohort, and progressively down its successive cohorts since about 1991. And what it shows that for each of these cohorts, all of them, as they pass the driving age, are increasing their car use for the following 10, 20 years. They all grow. Each cohort is and they all start at the same point, 0, but each cohort is increasing its car use less than the older cohort. And that's been going on for about 20, maybe 30 years. It's an odd phenomenon. You have to think dynamically, because what it means is if no individual reduces their car use at all, they can all reduce their car use, and the overall amount of car use logically can go down over time, which is an extraordinary... think about it, it's true. The reason why it's true is of fundamental importance when we think of the time scale of the impacts of transport policies. Another phenomenon is, you can't see that, I'll move on. Another phenomenon is a lot of young people were not deciding to abandon the idea of car ownership or use entirely. They were delaying their car use for 10 years or 20 years, connected with various demographic circumstances. The interesting thing is that it's empirical. I mean, I don't know why this should happen, is that the later you learn to drive, the less you drive when you do start to drive. Now, some of them, of course, never started to drive, but the ones that did were driving less. And again, this creates a downward factor on car use. I thought that this argument was unique to research in the UK. I was quite wrong in that. Some interesting work in Stockholm seems to suggest the same sort of effects, though not using this quasi-dynamic form of analysis. And I'd particularly mention research in Paris and Montreal by Jean-Loup Madre and his colleagues, which I won't say more now because they're here, and I hope they'll say a bit more about the work, but it does seem to me it may turn out to be even more important than the British work in terms of this dynamic of car use trends. And the same sort of research also produced a whole set of socio and demographic reasons why it might have happened, of which some are nothing to do with transport policy. They're about education, they're about later age of marriage and childbearing, different family of household formation, and economic trends of less reliable employment, more rapid turnover, and a move towards urbanisation at the same time. And all of these interweave, and they make sense. Now, that doesn't seem to have been driven by transport policy, but the impact of transport policy is moderated by the existence of those social trends, generally speaking, so far, in a way which is in accord with trying to get long-term success for sustainable transport policies. Now, the next section of my paper, which I won't go through, what I tried to do is take a longer history for the UK, starting with about 1900, to demonstrate that these policy arguments have been going on throughout. and there have been different policy arguments in prominence or defeated from time to time, but there never was a time when this policy argument did not exist in the languages of the time. And I don't know whether that's true in all big cities or not. It's this idea of a permanent but unresolved history, where what we're saying now is not actually the first time anybody's thought of it. It's been a permanent battle, if you want to call it that, which has gone on and will continue to go on. I won't go through the details of that history. I find it quite interesting, but perhaps less so to yourselves than to me. But the key question is, does this mirror the experience in other countries? Some of us round the table, not all, are old enough to have been involved in earlier stages of this discussion before the language that it's conducted in now. And I think that it's right. Anyway, if I just move that on quickly enough so you can see what I was going to say. 1944, for the first signs of predict and provide, no model, but car ownership will increase, therefore we have to have large-scale road building, followed by the Buchanan report, which you'll all have heard of. And I just want to read, because of the company here, what the invisible paragraph at the bottom. 1963, this is a photograph of Los Angeles. Very influential report. He said, there is nothing to suggest that we would gain by spreading out our own cities or still further spreading the conurbations in order to reproduce the conditions of Los Angeles. All the American experience of sprawl suggests that in our small country we would do well to have no more of it. I'm hoping that our American colleagues are not deeply wounded by that, and I suspect they're actually rather delighted. Anyway, that was in 1964. By 1966, the 1944 road plans had come back, again on a predict and provide basis. Car ownership is going to go up. Public transport use is going to go down. We need new roads to meet the demand, and public transport will only stay as a survival for the residue of people declining who won't be travelling by car. And this was in turn greeted by political campaigns and demonstrations and public inquiries and elections, and it was defeated, but not forever. And so it goes on. This is the experience. In 1989, there was a turning point in the UK because the car use forecasts new forecasts came out bigger than they'd ever done before, so big that it was quite impossible to design a road building strategy which would cope with that forecast increase in car use. And that was the time at which demand management became the key of transport policy, not out of moral or health reasons, but because it was impossible to do anything else if the car ownership forecasts and car use forecasts were right. And then we go into all the research on disappearing traffic and induced traffic and reallocation of road capacity and so on. Susan Owens at that time invented the phrase from predict and provide to predict and prevent as being the key policy task of transport planners. And we're in an area of all sorts of uncertainty. Okay, brief skim through. The last point I want to make is where we're going to next on urban transport policy, and I divide that into two different categories. If we look at considerations of congestion and health and air quality and social inclusion, all of those support reducing car traffic in towns. All of those things would benefit if there's less traffic. And it doesn't have to be very big reductions in traffic. I had in mind something like 1 or 2% a year, sustained for 20 years, achieved by a focus on land use planning and public transport improvements and reallocation of road space to active modes, stronger enforcement, pricing, and stopping the policies which undermine those, which I mentioned earlier, on extra road and parking capacity and reducing fuel costs. I think that would do it. That is not difficult, provided you have the sustained determination to do it. The levers are strong enough, we now know, to do that. But what if we introduce climate emergency into that equation? Then, it's a pity that Gillian Annable, who was due to be here but unfortunately had to apologise because she's ill, and she's done some very important work on that, even on the most optimistic assumptions about transition to electric vehicles. Carbon targets will not be achieved, once you included embedded carbon as well, unless there are bigger reductions in car use than that. And I calculate that's would need about 5 or 6% per year sustained. And nobody is adopting policies that would achieve that at the moment. And I think that's a problem, because we know that climate change is the most important policy, more so than congestion and air quality and so on, and we're simply not working out a policy package that would achieve it. So I had in mind to demonstrate that the argument on this is as much by images as by research. In one sense, zero car growth in urban areas is a sort of compromise between increasing car use and reducing it. And so it resembles a sort of peak car stabilisation, and as a compromise it seeks agreement with political advantages if it can be done in a way which nothing is taken away from the present voters, only something is offered to them. And I don't see how that can be done. I don't see how you can balance the zero car growth without actually taking away road capacity at a level which would reduce car use. And that's just a question which I look forward to in the next Book 1 session. I will stop there. Well, I've taken my 29.5 minutes. Sorry about that, but I hope that's been okay. Thanks very much.